Hello and welcome to the preview here on the Fulhamish YouTube channel. No Elizabeth today, so you'll have to put up with me. We are looking ahead to Newcastle United versus Fulham on Saturday at St James's Park. Soon I'll chat to Andrew Musgrove from the Everything is Black and White podcast to get their perspective on the match. But first of all, let's dive into Fulham and how we will approach this game. Obviously, we're looking to avoid 4 consecutive league defeats, something that hasn't happened under Marco Silva's tenure. And whilst it's understandable on paper, the games that we've lost, Villa away, Bournemouth away, and then Arsenal at home, making it 4, it wouldn't tip us into crisis, quite far from it, but it puts us under an awful lot of pressure if we do go into that Wolves game on the back of 4 consecutive defeats, because if it becomes 5, if it becomes 6, then fans are going to start getting very tetchy. You imagine that the pressure on the players is going to ramp up. So I think it's really important that we get a result this weekend. And look, Newcastle, they're doing well in the Champions League. They've lost some tough games at St James's Park, the likes of Arsenal and Liverpool, but they're a point and a place above us in the table. This is a winnable game, even though they have got a brilliant squad. They also played on Tuesday in the Champions League, whilst Fulham have a week's recovery going into this match. So there are some things going in our favour. The team news for this match is particularly interesting. Marco did his press conference only about half an hour before recording this. It looks like Joachim Andersen is going to be out for this match. Anthony Robinson is still injured. Kenny Tete, though, back in contention, which is very interesting, something that I would certainly push for. I'm a huge fan of Kenny Tete. I really believe that we are a much, much better side with him in. He was on the bench against Arsenal. Would love to see him come back in at right back. Another player that's coming back a little bit sooner than anticipated. Whether he'll start, I'm not sure, but Sasha Lukić apparently is back in contention. Marco Silva said that in his press conference. So could we be back to the Sasha and Sander double pivot? Harry Wilson is going to be out almost certainly if we are to believe what Marco says. So we've got an interesting problem of what to do at right wing. Samuel Chukwueze is still out. Apparently Muniz' recovery is going better than planned, but still he's not going to be in contention for this game. So how do Fulham approach it? Well, the big question is whether Marco's going to go for a back 4 or for a back 5. I could see him doing the 5 here, sitting in, trying to frustrate Newcastle so they can't play us on the counter, which is like how they like to play football. It would kind of make sense. You'd be able to play Cuenca, Diop and Bassi at the back. It gets the best out of Ryan Sessegnon and out of Kenny Tete. The only issue with the back 5 is exactly what we do in midfield and up front. Obviously, I think Sander Berge plays. That's pretty much par for the course now. But what you then do further ahead, I think, is interesting. You imagine Iwobi will play somewhere. You feel like Josh King is not going to get dropped by Marco Silva. So then you've got, obviously, Raul to fit in there as well. You've only got one spot left. One thing that I wonder if he might do, if he did do the back 5, would be to play Sander Berge in the middle, have Josh King out left, which is something he can do, Alex Iwobi out right, and then Raul Jimenez up top. If he goes for the back 4, I think it's potentially a little bit easier to predict. I think he'll go for Sessegnon. I think that Bassi will come in and play alongside Diop as the right-sided centre-back with Kenny Tete on the right. Although Kenny is very much my hope, rather than he could put Timmy Castagna there, and they are pretty much interchangeable. In midfield, it's very interesting. Marco said in his press conference, basically ruled out the Iwobi in the middle chat. Now, maybe that's Marco trying to play a bit of mind games on Eddie Howe, trying to distract them from the fact that is his plan, or we just take Marco at his word that he does not see Alex Iwobi as a centre midfielder. I mean, obviously, certain fans have been calling for it, and Marco kind of addressed that in the press conference, saying fans can have their opinion, but that's not what I see. In the case of a back 4, I would imagine then it might be Sander Berge and Tom Kearney again. And then you would have Alex Iwobi on the left, Josh King in the middle, and with both Wilson and Chukwueze out, I think that would mean Adama coming onto the right. And I know that's not what many people want to hear. I guess the only positive is, could Adama get some luck out of Dan Burn? As we come on to do in the chat though, Dan is a much better defender than just to put a pacey winger against him and that'll be the end of his game. He's a little bit smarter than that. Interesting to see what Marco does here. I think he's got a lot of options, but obviously injuries are really making life difficult for him. For a more in-depth preview of the match, check out the Thursday Club with myself, George Cooper and Yusuf Kamari, and do check out the Fulhamish website. Jack Kelly will be releasing his latest View from the Press Box article, and Dan Cook writes a very interesting and compelling case for Alex Iwobi in the middle, even though if Marco's press conference is anything to go by, it's fallen on deaf ears. Andrew, welcome to Fulhamish.
Thank you very much. How are you doing? You well?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, thank you.
Well, it's been an interesting season for Newcastle United, going very well in Europe. I guess steady in the Premier League, but I guess bottom half of the table, 8 matches in, is not exactly where Geordie fans would have expected or hoped to have been. But then again, it was a very tumultuous summer, so maybe your expectations weren't too high for the start of the season.
Yeah, it's been a bit hit and miss, but there's been plenty of glimpses of how good Newcastle United are, even though the points return doesn't reflect that. We are just getting into kind of a new stage for Newcastle United, where I feel they're transitioning from a team that was just deadly on the counter to a team that is going to try and be in more control of the game. And as you mentioned there, the summer didn't help things, like either having to sell Alexander Isak, bringing in Nick Woltemade, who's been absolutely superb, but a totally different forward to Isak. So they're having to reinvent the wheel, really, in terms of how they play. And so that's kind of led itself into some of the results that we've seen. It's not been as bad as the point return suggests, and it's just all about waiting for it to click. And fingers crossed from a Newcastle point of view, it does on Saturday against Fulham.
Yeah, no, I think I'm under no illusions. It's almost like playing Newcastle in a false position. I feel like, yes, you're 1 point and a place above us in the table, but it doesn't really feel like. Normally, you would go into a game against a team in the bottom half and think, oh, we've got a really great chance of getting something here, but it just feels like this is a Newcastle side that's kind of waiting to gel, waiting to click. One player that hasn't really taken any time to settle, as you mentioned, is Woltemade. He is just amazing. I must admit, when you sold Isak, bought him in for a lot of money, it felt like from the outside that you'd overpaid for him, and that it was just, that's a natural what happens when you receive so much money for Alexander Isak. Other clubs who you were trying to buy players off were always going to take advantage of that, and he hadn't scored that many goals in the Bundesliga. There was obviously that weird criticism from the Bayern Munich president. So I remember thinking, oh, okay, I'm not so sure about this signing, but how wrong I and many other doubters were, certainly on first impressions. He looks incredible.
Yeah, it's his footwork more than anything. I mean, he's a tall guy, so the assumption is you've got to get the ball in the box, and he's actually scored a couple of headers, and he is deadly in the air, but it's his footwork. And if you underestimate how good he is with the ball at his feet, then you will get punished. He wants the ball into his feet. He can bring it down so well, better than most players I've seen. He's absolutely brilliant. And I think part of it is that he's just taken to the club and the fan base really well, which is difficult for most people, let alone a young man coming from another country, as you say, with a big price tag on his head as well. And then if you throw in the fact that he was coming in with the idea that Johan Wissa, Premier League experienced striker, would be playing probably the majority of the games to begin with and help Woltemade settle in, because that's what Eddie Howe does. He doesn't like to chuck new signings straight into the fire. You know, Vissa's been injured, hasn't played a single minute for Newcastle United, so it's all been on Woltemade to score goals for Newcastle, and he's done that 4 in the Premier League, 1 as well in the Champions League, and he's been absolutely brilliant, and it's been an absolute joy to watch, and a relief as well, because you're right, the price tag is goal scoring record in the Bundesliga, 12 for last season, but he'd only hit double figures once before that, and that was in the 3rd tier of the German league system. So not someone that necessarily commands a price tag of nearly £70 million, especially when he was only signed on a free the summer before, but he's looking like he's worth every single penny of that at the moment.
Yeah, Alexander Isak, who I think certainly seems to be the sentiment. Talk to me a bit about Newcastle's home form. I mean, people always say, it's almost a bit of a cliche, St James's Park is a fortress. But obviously in the last few years, results at St James's Park have backed up that cliche. you could, on one hand, say, well, there's been 3 defeats at St James's Park this season. But then when you look at who those 3 defeats are to, it's Liverpool, Arsenal and Barcelona. So it's not exactly giving Fulham loads of comfort that the home form's a little bit patchy. There's definitely an asterisk next to all 3 of those defeats. Yeah,
and having been in every single one of them, the results could have been very, very different. And Newcastle United, you could argue, deserved to get something out of each and every single one of those games. I mean, Liverpool, they were down to 10 men, but were by far the better side. Barcelona, they had the early chances in the first half, really were quite dominant. And it's just a case of, you don't take your chances against the world's best, then you will ultimately get punished. And that's exactly what happened. And then another late goal against Arsenal broke hearts right to death. They've performed really well in those games. I think the one question people ask, especially of late, is that why do they perform so well against the so-called bigger sides? And they do that, and then they face a team like Fulham. No disrespect to Fulham at all, but you're not Barcelona, you're not Liverpool, you're not Arsenal. And it is one of those games that you go, is this where Newcastle may slip up? And it would be very Newcastle United to play so well against Benfica on Tuesday and then come into this game on Saturday and lose to Fulham. It would feel very Newcastle United, although I'm sure Eddie Howe would have something to say about that. But you look back to the last game at St James's Park between these two sides, and I think Fulham hadn't won in 8 visits, if memory serves me correct. So we were going to that game thinking, Fulham don't like to come here. It's a bogey stadium to visit, and you deservedly won. So who knows what's going to happen on Saturday?
Yeah, it was interesting, that game at St James's Park last season. It just felt Fulham held on in the first half. We were only 1 down, but it should have been 2 or 3. And then I think we just managed to capitalise on the nerves around St James's, because I think the fans were thinking we should have wrapped up this game. And then Fulham were just pretty clinical with the 2 goals we scored. Both of them kind of came out of nowhere. A set piece flick on and quite a nicely worked team goal from Fulham for Raul Jimenez that got the equaliser. What is the blueprint to trying to face Newcastle and getting something from them? As you say, you've lost a few games this season, mostly against big sides, but obviously Brighton won last weekend. What is it when other teams do at St James's or away games as well that you go, oh no, it could be a tough day for us here?
Yeah, well, there's been an issue with the space behind the midfield and in front of the defence. Now, this was seen against Brighton away, but also it has been noted. I noted against Nottingham Forest, the game before the international break, which Newcastle won at home. And thankfully against Benfica, it looked like they'd learned the lessons of Brighton. And what we saw was one of the midfielders just sitting rather than all 3 of them, because they play 3 across the middle, stepping up. And that only works if you've then got the pressing nature of, up top. And that wasn't quite there against Brighton, hasn't been quite there all season. So if Fulham can exploit that gap behind the midfield and in front of the defence, then that will be a good way to get at Newcastle United. You've also got Dan Burn playing at left back, who has been tremendous, but he's not a left back, so that could be somewhere for maybe Wilson to target if indeed he plays on that right hand side. And it's interesting because Newcastle are going through this transition. They're still deadly on the counter, but if Fulham sit in and have that low block, then that can frustrate Newcastle United. Now, Bruno is very good at unlocking defences if they do sit deep, but it's not a guarantee. And I'd say at this point, Newcastle United are still probably more dangerous on the counter. So it might be in Fulham's interest to sit back and just try and invite Newcastle on rather than taking the game to Newcastle.
The preview on Fulhamish is brought to you by My Kind of Cruise, the world's first cruise booking app and website. Whether you're a seasoned voyager or you're embarking on a different kind of away day for the very first time, My Kind of Cruise has got you covered, with unbeatable prices and all the options under the sun that you can think of. From ice fishing like Rodrigo Muniz to tours around the Mediterranean and Caribbean. My Kind of Cruise is founded by a fellow Fulham fan, and Fulhamish listeners can get an exclusive discount at checkout with the code Fulhamish. Just head to mykindofcruise.com or download the app from the Google Play or Apple App Store.
Yeah, it's one reason I think Fulham might revert to the back 5, actually, Andrew, for this one, is just for that exact strategy of sit in for straight. And it's exactly what worked for us last season. We managed to kind of ride the wave of that first half. And then I think we grew in belief in the second that because it was only 1 goal deficit, that we could get back into it if we took our chances. And that's exactly what happened. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Marco go with a similar-ish game plan. You talk about the defence, and I guess, like looking at this from the outside, when you see Dan Burn and Kieran Trippier both have had fantastic careers. Obviously, Dan Burn, former Fulham player. We learned all too the hard way of what Dan Burn at fullback can be like, although he never seemed to replicate that Fulham form ever since he pulled on a Newcastle United shirt. I'm looking at someone like Fulham's winger Kevin, maybe getting a little bit of joy against someone like Kieran Trippier. Is it the fact that age is catching up with both of them, or are both still incredibly reliable fullbacks and am I maybe clutching at straws looking for positives?
I mean, Trippier was definitely within the conversation of being man of the match on Tuesday against Benfica. He was absolutely fantastic, and it's great to see because he's found a new lease of life at Newcastle United. He really, really has, and it's come because of injuries to other players. If Tino Livramento and Lewis Hall were both fit, then Kieran Trippier probably wouldn't be in at right back. But he's been handed that opportunity. That came the game before the Carabao Cup final last season, and ever since he's just been absolutely superb. And he's just adapted his game to getting older, but he's such a force. I mean, going forward, his delivery, his ability to pick up a progressive pass, superb. And he's still got a bit of speed about him as well. He's very clever. I think he understands he's not the quickest anymore, but he's kind of adapted his defensive style to make sure he can compensate for that. And on the other side, look, Dan Burn, I think most teams will target, but it's not a given that, even if you're the world's paciest winger, you will beat him. He's been fantastic over the last season and a bit at centre-half, and he's put on a bit of weight to make sure that he is being the very best he can be, and at times he's been absolutely unstoppable. I just think at left-back, he's not the quickest, although sometimes the way he manages to keep up or recover is unbelievable, given he does like that little bit of pace. The danger is if you get the ball over the top of him, then and the winger gets in, then if you get around the back of him as well, we do have an issue. And it's just about, in many ways, I think Dan Burn looking across the line and adapting and taking a lesson from Kieran Trippier's book. It's just difficult because, like I say, for the last year and a bit, he's been arguably Newcastle's best centre back, and unfortunately, Lewis Hall being injured, Dan Burn has had to go back to left back where it isn't his strongest position, but he puts everything into it.
Yeah, completely. And just looking this season for Newcastle, you mentioned it's a bit of a transition year. The monkey's off the back in terms of you won the Carabao Cup. You also got into the Champions League. Last year was a hugely successful season for Newcastle. What is the next step, really? Because it is an interesting limbo, right? It's very, very hard to break into that kind of like top tier of the Premier League season in, season out, although you've kind of had brushings with it. Where do Newcastle go from here? Do you think it's going to take a season or two? Do you think it's going to take a change of manager for Newcastle to reach the level that we all know that your owners eventually want Newcastle to reach?
No, I think Eddie Howe is the man to reach that level. It's going to take year in, year out qualification for the Champions League. I think that's no secret, and Newcastle have done that 2 years out of the last 3. The Champions League is where the money is. That's the lucrative reward. That's how you build and maintain the squad that you've got. We've got some really good players. We've got 3 or 4, maybe 5 players who would, really walk into a lot of top sides. I'm talking Man City's, your Barcelona's. I mean, Sandro Tonali is one of the best midfielders in Europe. So you need Champions League football to offer that to them, but also to bring the money in to keep them here, to tie them down to longer deals, and also to then bring in the players who can take you to the next level, because it's a sign of ambition. But look, Eddie Howe, I think, is the man to do that. These players who have come in, buy into how he builds a team, how he trains a team. He's turned players into, Dan Burn, for example. Who would have thought? England cap, absolutely brilliant. That's down to Eddie Howe and his staff. Joe Linton, Brazilian international. You would have been laughed off the street had you suggested that a few years back. And that's down to Eddie Howe and his methods and the players buying into Eddie Howe. So no doubt about Eddie Howe. He's the man for the long term for Newcastle United. And I think it just depends on that consistent offering of Champions League football. And I think they will get it this season. They've got a good squad. Probably could do with a new left back in January, and maybe another midfielder as well. But they've got a rotation element now of the squad that didn't have 2 years ago, and that meant they didn't qualify for the Champions League last season, to play in the Champions League last season, whereas this time they have got good numbers in the squad. I think Eddie Howe's getting to grips with that. Could be an interesting team selection on Saturday, because you've got a Carabao Cup coming on the Wednesday, and then West Ham on the Saturday, then another Champions League game after that. So he's just getting to grips with rotating that side. It's a new experience for him, but so far he's not doing too bad of a job, and we're just waiting for it to click. And once it does, I think we'll see Newcastle United, like they did last season, go on quite an unbeaten run of games and shoot straight back up the table.
Yeah, I'm hoping that click doesn't arrive on Saturday, but we'll wait and see. Andrew, I just want you to get 2 predictions off you before we finish. First of all, just a pretty standard match prediction, but then I'd also love what we call 100-1 prediction. So this is just something silly, but if it, maybe it's a Dan Burn hat trick or something like that, but something that if it happens, what we'll do is we'll clip it up on Sunday and you will look like a genius out of context. So first of all, just a standard match prediction. What are you going for?
We go for 2-1 victory to Newcastle.
Okay. And then your outlandish, almost borderline impossible prediction that could come true and you'll look like a genius.
Oh dear. Okay, I reckon Marco Silva is going to lose it slightly and get sent to the stands.
I mean, I'd actually say that's probably about like 10-1. So it happens most games that he loses it. Normally when VAR make a horrible decision at our expense. Andrew, thanks so much for jumping on and being on the preview today.
Pleasure, enjoyed it.